Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are dissecting a phenomenon that is fundamentally reshaping the social fabric of the modern world. We're looking at the intensification of gender conflict, but not in the way it's usually discussed on, social media or cable news. We're looking at data that suggest this has moved far beyond simple differences of opinion or the age-old battle of the sexes. We are witnessing what the material describes as a structural disconnect and how the younger generation views dating, marriage, and partnership itself.
It's a profound shift, yeah. And to frame the central tension we're exploring today, we have to ask if the collapse of the traditional relationship model is a rational response to these divergent realities and what the data calls deal-breaker values. Or is it something darker? Are we witnessing a tragic death of dialogue fueled by algorithmic segregation that's forcing men and women into these hostile corners?
Exactly. And I'm going to argue that the data reflects a rational realignment, that women are rejecting an outdated contract because, frankly, the terms of that contract no longer serve them. The conflict arises because women now treat political ideology and personal autonomy as non-negotiable core values. And that's a necessary boundary.
And I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. I believe that while the grievances are very real, the conflict is being artificially amplified by this vicious cycle of digital segregation. I think the disconnect is driven by algorithms that isolate genders into hostile feedback loops, which prevents the genuine understanding that could, actually solve the problem.
Okay, well, let's get right into the position statements, because the numbers here are stark. My position is that this shift is driven primarily by the happiness gap. For decades, the narrative has been that, marriage and children are the ultimate destination for a fulfilling life. But when you look at the source material, that narrative has just collapsed for women. We're seeing a statistic where only 32% of women believe that marriage and children lead to a happier life. Now compare that to the 58% of men who still hold that positive view. That is a massive discrepancy.
It is a significant gap, certainly.
It's more than significant. It's a revelation. It suggests that women are choosing singlehood not out of spite and not because they're being brainwashed by TikTok, but because the traditional model simply does not offer them fulfillment anymore. The data shows that for women, the personal has absolutely become political. The refusal to date across party lines, which I'm sure we'll get into, isn't petty tribalism. It is a necessary filter for survival and for dignity. When the standard life milestone of marriage becomes a source of unhappiness for the majority of women, well, opting out is the only rational economic and emotional choice.
I see why you'd frame it that way, but let me offer a different perspective. I think looking at this solely as a rational choice ignores the systemic tragedy unfolding here. My position is that we're witnessing a calcification of society, and it's driven by a lack of shared reality. You mentioned that men still view marriage positively, and that's key. The material highlights that 57% of single men still view starting a family as a vital goal. The desire for connection, it exists. It hasn't just vanished, but it's being thwarted.
Thwarted by what, though? By digital segregation, by a lack of dialogue. We're creating a scenario where men feel like victims of reverse discrimination. And whether you agree with that assessment or not, the feeling is real and potent. While at the same time, women perceive men strictly as threats. When you treat every single disagreement as a deal breaker, and when algorithms are constantly feeding you confirmation of your worst fears, you ultimately trap the younger generation in this lonely defensive state. We're building a world where that happiness gap is cemented because we've stopped even trying to bridge it.
That's an interesting way to put it, though. I'd frame it differently. You talk about bridging a gap, but you can't bridge a gap when the foundations on either side are completely different. So, let's move into our first core area of debate, political polarization. The source material brings up ideological vetting. This is one of the most striking data points we have. Approximately 43% of Gen Z women in the US refuse to date opposing voters. That's double the rate of men, which sits at 21%.
And that is exactly the asymmetry I'm worried about.
But why are you worried about it? This isn't about women being closed-minded. The material calls this asymmetric rejection. The reason double the amount of women are filtering out men based on politics is because women view issues like, say, reproductive rights as core values.
In contrast, the data shows men are more likely to dismiss these political differences as mere disagreements. Look, if I'm a woman and a potential partner votes for policies that restrict my bodily autonomy, that is not a disagreement on tax brackets. That's a fundamental threat to my existence. The refusal to date that person is a rational safety measure.
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes that the label voter for X party carries the totality of a person's character and beliefs. That is a very modern, and I would argue a very dangerous heuristic. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that cutting off 50% of the population leads to a healthier society. And while I understand the gravity of issues like reproductive rights, preemptively excluding matches with political party filters just creates an echo chamber.
But isn't a relationship supposed to be an echo chamber of shared values on some level? Why should anyone be obligated to date someone who fundamentally opposes their worldview?
Because opposing worldview is often a caricature that's created by distance. This rigidity contributes to the death of dialogue. If you never interact with someone who thinks differently than you do, you never humanize them, you never challenge their views, and they never challenge yours in a way that creates growth. You just retreat further and further into your corner. The material suggests this leads to a state where men and women are literally living in different realities. If we filter everyone out before the first coffee, we lose the very friction that actually builds a robust society.
I think that prioritizes the health of society over the safety and happiness of individual women. You're asking women to do the emotional labor of humanizing men who might vote against their own interests. Dialogue is, well, it's impossible without shared fundamental values. If one partner views the other's rights as debatable, the relationship is structurally unsound from the start. It's not about growth. It's about the structural integrity of the partnership. If the foundation is cracked, you don't build a house on it just for the sake of dialogue.
That is a compelling argument. But have you considered the consequences of this kind of stalemate? This brings us to the second core point, the vicious cycle. The material gives us a fascinating, if alarming, case study from South Korea. It talks about the negative feedback loop.
Yes, the demographics there are very telling.
They're terrifying. You have a marriage squeeze, which is a structural surplus of men over women. This leads to what the text calls male deprivation. Now, logically, you might think men would try harder to be appealing, but the material notes that when men project that disappointment onto feminism, they exhibit hostile sexist attitudes. They feel the system has rigged the game against them, and this hostility is palpable.
And that hostility validates the women's choice to opt out.
But it's a cycle. The hostility validates the exit, and the exit amplifies the hostility. It's a machine that just generates misery.
I see why you think it's a cycle, but I interpret the South Korean example differently. The material highlights the 4B movement: no marriage, childbirth, dating, or sex. I don't see that as just part of a feedback loop. I see it as a logical, protective response to the very hostility you just described. If the result of male deprivation is that men oppose women's empowerment policies, which the text says they do, and become hostile, why on earth would any woman enter that market?
I'm not saying they should enter a hostile market. I'm saying the dynamic itself is a tragedy.
But calling it a tragedy implies it's just some sad accident. It's not. It's a consequence. The 4B movement is women looking at the deal on the table: marriage, childcare, dealing with the partner who resents feminism, and saying no deal. If men fear losing their patriarchal status, as the text suggests, and women refuse to be integrated into that status, that is not a stalemate where no one wins. That is women finally winning their autonomy by refusing to play a rigged game. Marriage is viewed as a system to be avoided for survival. That sounds rational to me.
Acknowledging the logic doesn't remove the tragedy, though. The source material notes this creates a state where men fear losing status while women refuse integration. The result is just loneliness on a massive scale. And I want to push back on the idea that this is entirely organic. And this brings us to our third point, algorithmic interference. We cannot ignore the machine in the middle of all this.
The algorithms play a role, sure.
They don't just play a role, they're the directors of the play. The material discusses algorithmic polarization. Platforms like TikTok are supplying men with manosphere content. Think Andrew Tate, anti-feminist narratives,
At the very same time, they're providing women with content focused on feminism or, alerts about male violence. We are living in distinct information ecosystems.
I agree the ecosystems are distinct.
It makes mutual understanding nearly impossible. I mean, if I'm a young man, my phone is telling me that women are out to get me, that I'm a victim of reverse discrimination, and that I need to take back control. If I'm a young woman, my phone is telling me that men are predators and threats. How can we possibly expect these two people to meet for a drink and have a normal conversation? The algorithm has poisoned the well before they even get there.
I'm not fully convinced by that because it kind of excuses the underlying reality. I can see that algorithms amplify these sentiments, but algorithms are prediction engines. They show us what keeps us engaged. They wouldn't work if the underlying divergent perceptions of reality weren't already there. Andrew Tate didn't invent misogyny, he just monetized it. The feeling of mutual hostility is rooted in the real-world inequity of the traditional family formation model, not just on our screens. The algorithms are holding up a mirror, and we just don't like what we see.
I think that gives the technology too much credit for neutrality. These platforms are designed to maximize engagement, and outrage is the most engaging emotion there is. By constantly feeding men content that validates their feeling of deprivation and feeding women content that validates their fear, the technology is actively severing communication. It creates a calcification. It hardens hearts that might otherwise be open. It turns what could be confusion about dating into a war over survival.
But if the traditional family formation model was actually working, if it was actually making people happy, no amount of TikTok videos could break it. The fact that it's so fragile suggests it was already broken. The algorithm might be the wind, but the house was already falling down.
Or perhaps the house needed repairs and the algorithm brought a bulldozer. That's the distinction.
Well, let's look at the happiness gap again in this context. If 58% of men are happy with the idea of marriage, but they're consuming content that tells them they're victims, isn't that a massive cognitive dissonance? The material says they project disappointment onto feminism. That is a failure of emotional processing, not just an algorithmic trick.
It is a failure of processing, but it's one that is being exploited. The marriage squeeze is a demographic reality, a structural surplus of men. That's just hard math. When you combine hard math with an algorithm that tells you it's not your fault, it's their fault, you get radicalization. You get the hostility that then validates the 4B movement. It's a machine that eats its own tail. And treating it as purely a rational realignment just ignores the human cost of that isolation.
The human cost is high, I'll admit that, but the cost of the previous system was borne almost entirely by women, and that is what is changing. The ideological battleground is messy, yes, but it's preferable to a false peace where women had to stifle their core values just to keep that peace.
And I worry that the ideological battleground leaves us with nothing but casualties. If we view relationships as systems to be avoided, we lose the fundamental human experience of partnership.
Let's move to our conclusion, because we're circling a very complex issue here. From my perspective, the data is clear. The redefinition of dating as an ideological battleground is a necessary evolution. We can't go back. As long as political ideology is a definitive deal breaker on basic human rights, and as long as that massive happiness gap exists where marriage benefits men so much more than women, then women are being completely rational to prioritize singlehood. They're choosing themselves over a standard life milestone that, statistics show simply doesn't serve them.
And I come at it from the perspective that while the grievances are undeniably real, the current trajectory is one of digital segregation and profound isolation. We are letting algorithms dictate our humanity. And I would warn that if we continue to view relationships as systems to be avoided rather than romantic unions, and if we treat every difference as a threat instead of a challenge, we risk a permanent inability to communicate across the gender divide. We're calcifying into separate, lonely worlds.
It's a structural disconnect deeply rooted in our current reality. And whether that disconnect protects us or destroys us, well, that remains the open question.
Indeed. And to our listeners, we leave you with that. Is the person across the table an ideological enemy or a potential bridge to a shared reality?
Thank you for listening to The Debate.